They didn't raise their voices when they said it. They didn't need to. At breakfast, overlooking the lake my grandparents built their lives around, my parents smiled and announced they were giving the family lake house to my brother. No discussion. No hesitation. Just a decision made long before I sat down with my coffee. They told me I'd always be welcome as long as I coordinated. I stayed quiet. Not because I agreed, but because I knew something they didn't. When the attorney arrived and opened his folder, the room went silent. Because the house they were giving away? It was never theirs to give. The morning light spilled across the lake in a way that usually made everything feel softer, pale gold on the water. A breeze just strong enough to ripple the surface. For most of my life, mornings like this at the lake house meant laughter drifting from the kitchen, bare feet on cold wood floors, and coffee poured without asking. That morning felt different. My name is Clara Whitmore, and as I stood at the edge of the dock, mug warming my hands, I had the unmistakable sense that this gathering wasn't casual at all. It was staged. Every chair pulled out, every place set. Even the pastries arranged too neatly by my mother, Elaine Whitmore, on the old oak table felt like props. My father, Richard Whitmore, barely looked at the water. He kept glancing at his watch, the way he did before difficult conversations he didn't want to lead. When my brother Daniel Whitmore arrived with his wife Marissa and their 2 kids, he looked relaxed, almost confident, like someone walking into a meeting he already knew the outcome of. "Beautiful morning," Daniel said easily, setting his keys down as if this place already answered to him. I smiled, because that's what I've always done. I took my seat quietly, listening to the familiar sounds, the kettle clicking off, cutlery touching plates, while something tight settled in my chest. No one had said anything yet, but I knew, with a certainty I couldn't explain, that this morning wasn't about breakfast. It was about a decision that had already been made and I had only been invited to witness it. We didn't even finish our coffee before my mother cleared her throat. Elaine folded her hands together on the table, the way she did when she wanted everyone to listen without interruption. My father straightened in his chair beside her, nodding once as if the words had already been practiced the night before. "Clara," she began gently, using my name like a cushion, "your father and I have been thinking a lot about the future of this place." I waited. Richard spoke next. "We're not getting any younger. The lake house is a lot to maintain, and we want to make sure it stays in the family." Daniel leaned back in his chair, one arm resting comfortably behind Marissa's seat. She smiled at him, already knowing where this was going. "So we've decided," my mother continued, her voice lifting slightly, "to give the house to Daniel." The words landed quietly, no dramatic pause, no glance in my direction. They talked about stability. About children growing up with summers on the lake. About responsibility and legacy. Daniel nodded along, accepting it the way someone accepts a promotion they were always meant to receive. I sat there, my hands wrapped around a mug that had gone cold, listening as my future was revised without my input. "You'll always be welcome here," Elaine added quickly, sensing the silence. "This will still be your home too." Marissa chimed in before I could respond. "Of course. We'll just need to coordinate weekends once things are official." Official. I smiled again, because that's what I do when I'm being pushed aside politely. They spoke as if they were being generous, as if I were being included. No one asked what I thought. No one asked if I agreed. The decision had been made long before breakfast was served and my role in it had already been assigned. As the conversation moved on, I realized no one was watching me anymore. My parents talked about property taxes and upkeep, about how manageable things would be once Daniel took over. Daniel talked about replacing the dock next spring, about finally fixing the upstairs bathroom. Marissa pulled out her phone and started scrolling, already checking dates on a shared calendar. It struck me then how natural it felt to them to speak around me, not to me. In their version of the story, my place was already clear. I was the daughter who came and went. The one without children, without roots here. The one whose life still felt temporary to them, even though I'd been living on my own terms for years. I thought about the way my mother still slipped me gas money when I visited, or asked if I was doing okay in that careful voice she used when she worried I might be struggling. I drove an older car. I lived simply. I didn't correct them when they filled in the blanks for me. Daniel, on the other hand, fit the picture perfectly. Married, organized, confident, A man who looked like ownership belonged to him. So once everything's transferred, Marissa said casually, we'll probably block off most summer weekends for the kids. She said it without malice. Without hesitation. I nodded, even though something inside me tightened. Every assumption stacked neatly on top of the next, forming a version of me that required no authority, no say. No one had asked if I accepted this role. They didn't need to. My silence had been mistaken for agreement for years. That morning, it became permission, and as I sat there, listening to plans being made in a house full of my memories, I understood something clearly for the first time. They weren't taking anything from me. They were simply certain I'd never claim it. My father stood and reached for the coffee pot, refilling cups that didn't need it. It was something he did when he wanted his hands busy, when conversation had crossed into territory he'd rather manage than feel. We'll get the paperwork done today, he said, as casually as if he were talking about replacing a light fixture. I asked the attorney to come by mid-morning. That word paperwork settled over the table with a sense of finality. Daniel perked up immediately. Good. I took the day off work, he said. Figured we'd knock it out and then let the kids enjoy the lake. I tanned. Marissa nodded. I already made a list of repairs we want to prioritize. Once it's official, it'll be easier to justify the costs. Official. Again. No one questioned what exactly would be signed. No one asked to see documents. In their minds, ownership was a formality, not a fact. Something passed down through intention rather than record. I watched steam curl from my mug and thought about how confidently they spoke about renovations, schedules, improvements, about a future that now excluded my authority entirely. They talked as if the house were already changing hands, as if the decision itself carried legal weight. Outside, the lake was calm, indifferent to human certainty. Gravel crunched in the driveway just after 10. The sound cut cleanly through the conversation. My mother looked up first. That must be him, she said, smiling. Daniel pushed back his chair, already standing, his confidence unshaken. Papers would be signed, plans would be confirmed. This chapter, in their minds, was nearly closed. As I listened to footsteps approach the door, I took one slow breath. They were about to learn something none of them had bothered to ask. The attorney introduced himself as Michael Grant, a tall man in his 60s with neatly combed gray hair and a leather briefcase that looked older than the house itself. He shook hands all around, polite but efficient, then took the empty seat at the head of the table. Shall we begin? He asked, opening his briefcase. Daniel leaned forward, already smiling. My parents settled into their chairs, relieved, as if the difficult part of the morning was finally over. Michael Grant pulled out a thin folder and adjusted his glasses. Before we execute any transfer documents, he said evenly, I'll need to confirm the current ownership status of the property. There was a pause, small, almost unnoticeable, but it shifted something in the room. Elaine frowned. Well, it's in our names, she said. It came to us after my father passed. The attorney didn't respond right away. He flipped a page. Then another. The sound of paper against paper suddenly felt loud. I just want to be precise, he said carefully. Property transfers depend on the most recent recorded deed. Daniel exhaled through his nose, impatience creeping into his posture. Isn't this all pretty straightforward? He asked. We're ready to sign. Michael Grant looked up then, his expression neutral but focused. That's exactly why I'm checking. The room went quiet. Even the kids stopped whispering to each other at the far end of the table. My father shifted in his chair. My mother's smile tightened, uncertain now. The attorney read silently for another few seconds. Too long for comfort. Finally, he cleared his throat. I'm afraid this isn't as straightforward as you believe, he said. Daniel's smile faltered. What do you mean? Michael Grant closed the folder halfway, resting his hand on it. According to county records, this property is not currently owned by Richard and Elaine Whitmore. The words landed slowly, like something heavy being set down. And in that moment certainty gave way to confusion. No one spoke. The silence that followed felt unreal, as if the air itself had thickened around the table. My mother's eyes darted between the attorney and my father, searching for a correction that didn't come. That can't be right, Daniel said finally, his voice sharp with disbelief. We've been paying taxes. We've been maintaining the place. Michael Grant nodded once, as if he had expected the objection. You've contributed, yes, he said calmly. But contribution and ownership are not the same thing. He reopened the folder and slid a document forward, turning it so everyone could see. 8 years ago, he continued, this property was purchased through a private sale. The recorded owner is Clara Whitmore. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. What? She whispered. The attorney didn't rush. The purchase occurred during your father's final illness, he explained, looking at my parents. The property was at risk due to outstanding medical expenses and a loan secured against the land. Miss Whitmore paid fair market value and assumed all ongoing costs. Daniel stared at me like I had become someone else entirely. You, he said. That's impossible. I set my mug down carefully. It's not. Michael Grant continued, listing figures in a steady, professional tone: purchase price, annual taxes, insurance, maintenance, numbers that told a story I had never needed to say out loud. You've been reimbursing Clara for a small portion of the taxes, he added. The remainder and all major expenses have been covered by her. My father's face drained of color. Why didn't we know? Because no one asked, I said quietly. Daniel pushed his chair back an inch, anger replacing confusion. You let us believe this was still the family house. It is the family house, I replied. I just made sure it didn't disappear. Michael Grant closed the folder. To be clear, he said, there will be no transfer today. This property has belonged to Clara Whitmore for 8 years. The truth settled heavily over the table. Not as a victory, but as a reckoning no one had prepared for. For a moment, no one seemed to know where to look. The house itself felt different now, too quiet, too exposed, like a stage after the curtain has been pulled back. My mother's shock slowly turned into something harder to name, a confusion rooted not in the paperwork but in me. But, you never said you had that kind of money, Elaine finally said. You live so simply. I met her gaze. Because my life isn't a performance. Michael Grant didn't interrupt as I explained, briefly and without flourish. The consulting firm I'd built in my 20s. The clients I kept quiet. The steady growth that never needed an audience. I didn't mention numbers until the attorney did it for me. Daniel's jaw tightened. So this whole time you were, what? Letting us worry about you? I never asked you to, I said. You assumed. That's when the conversation shifted. It was no longer about the lake house. It was about power. My parents struggled to reconcile the version of me they had carried for years, the daughter still finding her way, with the reality sitting across from them. To them, my success wasn't impressive. It was unsettling. Daniel stood abruptly. This isn't fair, he said. You had all the control, and we didn't even know it. Control. The word landed wrong. I never controlled anything, I replied. I protected it. But I saw it then why this hurt more than losing the house. If I could do this, quietly and competently, then the story they'd told themselves about who needed guidance and who deserved authority fell apart. The problem wasn't my silence. It was what my success exposed. And for the first time, I understood that the lake house was never the real issue. It was the fact that I didn't need permission to hold it together. The morning unraveled quickly after that. Whatever celebration my parents had imagined quietly collapsed under the weight of what had been revealed. No one reached for the pastries anymore. The coffee sat untouched, growing cold between us. Marissa gathered the kids first, her movements sharp and efficient. We're leaving, she said, not looking at me. Daniel hesitated, torn between anger and something that looked dangerously like embarrassment. He opened his mouth as if to say more, then closed it again. Without another word, he followed his family out the door. The sound of their car pulling away down the gravel drive echoed longer than it should have. My parents remained seated, stunned. My mother's eyes were red, her hands folded tightly in her lap. My father stared at the table as though it might explain what had just happened. What happens now? He asked quietly. Nothing has to change, I said. You're still welcome here. Both of you. Always. But the words didn't land the way I intended. The truth had shifted the ground beneath us, and familiarity no longer felt automatic. The attorney packed his briefcase and excused himself, leaving us alone in the aftermath. The house felt larger, emptier, no longer held together by assumption. And as I looked around at the place I had saved, I understood something painful and clear. Keeping the house had been easy. Facing what the truth had broken would be much harder. I left the lake house just after noon. The sun was higher now, bright enough to make the water sparkle again, as if the morning hadn't happened at all. I paused at the end of the drive, looking back once at the house framed by trees and shoreline. Every summer, every holiday, every memory layered quietly inside it. I didn't feel victorious. As I drove away, the road curved along the lake, then pulled me back toward the city and the life I had built without witnesses. My phone buzzed once. Then again. I didn't look. I thought about how easily silence can be misunderstood, how restraint gets mistaken for dependence. For years, I had believed that keeping things simple kept the peace. I hadn't realized it also allowed others to write my story for me. The lake house had always been mine, not just legally, but in effort, in responsibility, in care. Owning it had never been about control. It had been about preservation. Still, something had shifted. You can hold a place together and still lose the version of family you thought lived there. Truth doesn't destroy what's strong, but it exposes what was only held together by assumption. I merged onto the highway, the house disappearing from view. I drove away with everything that was already mine. What I wasn't sure of yet was whether my family would ever see me the same way again. If you've stayed with me through this story, I want to speak to you directly, not as a narrator, but as a person who had to learn something the hard way. If you believe I did the right thing, I invite you to say so in the comments. And if you think I should have handled it differently, I want to hear that too. Stories like this don't exist to prove who's right, they exist to help us think more clearly about our own lives. What I learned is simple but not easy. Silence is not the same as peace. Protecting yourself, your work, and your future is not selfish, it's responsible. Don't let assumptions define your worth, and don't wait for permission to stand in your truth. If this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. Your engagement keeps these stories alive and reminds others they're not alone.